Good morning, America. Tonight, we begin with a decision that Pentagon officials, NATO commanders, and intelligence analysts across 3 continents had feared, anticipated, and now are scrambling to respond to. A decision that unfolded not over weeks of diplomatic negotiations, but in 48 hours. 48 hours that sent shockwaves through Moscow's military command. 48 hours that triggered emergency meetings inside the Kremlin. 48 hours that forced Vladimir Putin to reconsider his entire military strategy in Ukraine. What the Trump administration announced today crossed a line that Moscow had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Russia did not respond with strength. They responded with confusion, panic, and unprecedented military reshuffling. Tonight, we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about the next phase of this war. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another headline, it's a turning point. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official Pentagon statements, not formal White House announcements, just signals that the Trump administration was preparing something unprecedented. The administration has been unpredictable, yes, but they have been strategic in their unpredictability. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a logic, almost a pattern that experienced observers had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Pentagon communications and weapons logistics know the indicators, the classified briefings with European allies. The unusual shipments moving through polished logistics hubs, the sudden increase in encrypted communications between Washington and Kyiv, the diplomatic back channels that normally buzz with activity going completely dark. All of that went quiet, and whenever Washington goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For months, Russia had been watching the Trump administration's approach to Ukraine with a mixture of uncertainty and cautious optimism. There were moments when Moscow believed that this administration might pursue a different path, one that prioritized negotiation over escalation. There were signals, or what Moscow interpreted as signals, that suggested Washington might be willing to pressure Kyiv toward concessions. But those interpretations, we now know, were dangerously wrong. Because while Moscow was reading tea leaves and parsing every Trump statement for hidden meanings, the Pentagon was quietly assembling the most significant weapons package since the war began. And they did it without leaking a single detail. That, in itself, was remarkable. In a town where secrets have the shelf life of fresh fruit, this one held. And when it finally broke, it broke like a thunderclap. Early this morning, Pentagon officials confirmed what they described as a comprehensive weapons authorization package, including advanced long-range strike systems that had not been approved for Ukraine in over 2 years of conflict. These are the kinds of weapons systems that the United States only authorizes when they are signaling something very specific: total commitment to Ukrainian victory, a fundamental shift in escalation tolerance, or a complete abandonment of previous red lines. Moscow's analysts didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that Washington was changing its posture. And when a superpower shifts its military posture without explanation, even by inches, the Kremlin pays attention. The package, according to sources speaking with multiple outlets, includes several categories of weapons that Ukraine has been requesting for months: extended-range ATACMS missiles capable of striking deep into Russian-held territory, advanced drone systems with enhanced targeting capabilities, next-generation air defense components that would significantly strengthen Ukraine's protective umbrella, and, most significantly, authorization for Ukraine to use these systems against targets inside Russia itself. That last point is what made Moscow's blood run cold. For years, Washington had maintained a careful distinction: weapons for defense, not for striking Russian territory. That distinction evaporated this morning, and Putin noticed. Within hours of the announcement, satellite imagery showed unusual activity at multiple Russian military installations. Command vehicles were moving, communication arrays were being repositioned, and transport aircraft that normally sit idle were suddenly being fueled. Something had changed, and that something was panic. The statement issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was a direct message to Moscow. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Russia's recent actions as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, directly threatening to European security in ways that demanded a decisive response. For months, Moscow had believed that escalation dominance remained in their hands. They believed that by threatening nuclear rhetoric, by mobilizing forces, by launching waves of attacks on Ukrainian civilians, they could intimidate the West into hesitation. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. The Trump administration did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of the weapons authorization becoming public, Ukrainian forces began repositioning assets. These weren't the typical defensive arrangements we've seen over the past months. These were offensive preparations, systems, and units that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield dynamics. Military analysts watching the movements described them as methodical, precise, and clearly pre-planned. This wasn't a reaction. This was an execution. Ukraine had been waiting for this authorization, and the moment it came, they moved. The speed of that movement tells us something important. Kyiv and Washington had been coordinating this for weeks, possibly months, in complete secrecy. Moscow, despite its extensive intelligence apparatus, was caught completely off guard. And when you catch a nuclear superpower off guard, the results can be unpredictable. Tonight, we're seeing just how unpredictable. Tonight, multiple sources confirm that Ukraine has already begun integrating the newly authorized weapon systems into their operational planning. But more importantly, they've begun using them. Within 12 hours of the announcement, Ukrainian forces launched precision strikes on military targets that had previously been considered untouchable. They hit a major logistics hub in Belgorod region that had been funneling supplies to Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. They hit a command and control facility that intelligence analysts believe was coordinating drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. They hit an ammunition depot that satellite imagery showed had been recently expanded, likely in preparation for a spring offensive that may now never happen. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's military operations, the infrastructure that would have made their next offensive operational. This is what made the Pentagon's authorization so urgent. Russia's recent moves weren't just symbolic, they were actionable. They represented the kind of preparations that could have resulted in a major escalation if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian targets. They didn't attack population centers. They didn't escalate beyond military necessity. They hit logistics nodes. They hit command centers. They hit the infrastructure that Russia needs to sustain offensive operations. And they did it with precision that surprised even Western analysts. The accuracy of these strikes tells us something important about the intelligence sharing between Washington and Kyiv. These weren't lucky shots. These were surgical strikes based on real-time intelligence, which means the partnership between American intelligence and Ukrainian military operations has reached a new level of integration. And that integration is what has Moscow scrambling tonight, because they're not just facing Ukrainian forces anymore. They're facing Ukrainian forces with American eyes, American technology, and now American weapons that can reach targets Russia thought were safe. Nothing is safe anymore, and Putin knows it. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's recent provocations were designed to test the resolve of the Trump administration after months of mixed signals. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would blink, whether the administration's unpredictability would translate into paralysis, whether domestic political considerations would prevent decisive action. But instead, the opposite happened. The Trump administration didn't blink. They responded with an authorization package that was so comprehensive, so significant, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. They're masters of propaganda, of dismissing Western actions as irrelevant or theatrical. But today, there were no dismissive statements from Russian officials. There was only silence, and then movement. Military analysts, speaking with international media under anonymity, described Russia's response as reactive, a scramble to reposition assets and protect facilities that suddenly became vulnerable. This is not how a confident military power behaves. This is how a power that has been caught off guard behaves. Putin wanted to probe Washington's commitment. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defenses had minimal response time. That timing matters because it shows integration with real-time intelligence. It shows that Ukraine is not operating alone. They are operating as part of a coordinated Western response. And that coordination is what makes this moment so dangerous for Moscow, because Putin can calculate Ukrainian capabilities. He's been doing it for 3 years. But calculating American commitment? That's a different equation entirely, and today that equation changed. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out simultaneous strikes on at least 6 different targets, forcing Russian air defense systems to make impossible choices about prioritization. Artillery units targeted forward positions that had been reinforced in the last 72 hours, suggesting real-time intelligence about Russian movements. Special operations forces operating deep behind Russian lines reportedly disrupted communication networks used by Moscow to coordinate their forces. This wasn't just a response. This wasn't just a retaliation. This was a demonstration. This was a message. And that message is the one thing Russia has struggled to counter since this war began. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their calculations. For every weapon system they've deployed, Ukraine has found vulnerabilities. For every threat they've issued, Ukraine has responded with action. The asymmetry of this conflict has always favored Ukraine in terms of will, but now with these new weapons, it's beginning to favor them in terms of capability as well. And capability plus will is a combination that should terrify Moscow, because they've been betting for 3 years that Ukrainian will would eventually break, that Western support would eventually fade, that time was on their side. Tonight, that bet looks worse than ever. Remember, Putin thought this would be over in 3 days. He thought Kiev would fall before the West could respond. He thought Zelensky would flee and a puppet government would be installed. He thought NATO was too divided, too weak, too distracted to mount a meaningful response. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Kiev still stands, stronger and more defiant than ever. Zelensky has become a symbol of resistance recognized around the world. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades. And now, the most advanced weapons in the American arsenal are flowing into Ukrainian hands. Everything Putin calculated has proven wrong. Every assumption he made has been shattered. Every timeline he set has been blown apart. And now, 3 years into a war he thought would last 3 days, he's watching his military scramble to respond to weapons he never thought Ukraine would receive. History will record this moment. The moment when American commitment to Ukrainian victory became undeniable. The moment when Putin's gamble finally, definitively began to collapse. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest provocations happened at a time when he is under immense internal pressure. Russian military hardliners want escalation, want total commitment, want a mobilization that would dwarf anything seen so far. Russian oligarchs want an end to sanctions, want stability, want a return to the economic conditions that made them wealthy. Russian civilians want their sons and husbands home, want an end to the casualty reports, want normalcy to return. Russian security services want victory, but they also want to preserve the state apparatus that keeps them in power. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has gone worse than anyone in Moscow imagined. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. That's what makes this moment so unpredictable. A confident Putin is dangerous. A desperate Putin is more dangerous. And tonight, Vladimir Putin looks desperate. His military is scrambling. His propaganda machine is struggling to explain why targets inside Russia are suddenly being hit. His generals are repositioning forces to protect assets that were never supposed to be threatened. This is not the behavior of a leader in control. This is the behavior of a leader who has lost the initiative. And losing the initiative in war is often the first step toward losing the war itself. The Pentagon statement, now circulating through every major news outlet in the world, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russian aggression to go unanswered. And ban on. Officials said plainly that Russia's recent actions were inconsistent with any framework for peaceful resolution. That is diplomatic language for, we're done waiting for you to negotiate in good faith. You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon unless something serious is at stake, but there's more. The statement also included language about ensuring Ukrainian partners have the tools necessary to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Notice the word choice, not just defend, but restore. Territorial integrity. That's language that includes Crimea. That's language that includes the Donbass. That's language that Moscow absolutely did not want to hear, because it suggests that Washington's objectives have expanded. It's no longer just about stopping Russian advances. It's about reversing them. And reversing Russian territorial gains is the one outcome Putin cannot survive politically. He's staked everything on this war: his legacy, his power, his place in Russian history, and tonight that stake looks shakier than ever. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a firm, resolute speech tonight. He said, "Today, our partners have shown that they stand with us not just in words, but in weapons," he said. "Every missile system we receive is a message to Moscow that their aggression will not stand." And he said, "We did not choose this war, but we will choose how it ends, and it will end with Ukrainian victory." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky has walked a tightrope for 3 years, pleading for weapons while maintaining dignity, accepting aid while asserting sovereignty, fighting a superpower while keeping his people's spirits alive. Tonight, he sounded like a man who finally has the tools to finish the job, and that confidence was not lost on Moscow. Putin has tried everything to break Zelensky: assassination attempts, propaganda campaigns, missile barrages on civilian infrastructure. Nothing has worked. And now, Zelensky stands stronger than ever, with American weapons flowing into his arsenal. That has to be Putin's worst nightmare come to life. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest provocations weren't isolated. Along with their military posturing near Ukraine, Russian naval vessels increased activity in the Black Sea, testing Ukrainian coastal defenses. Russian cyber units launched renewed attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, attempting to disrupt communications. Russian aligned forces in other regions increased their operational tempo, suggesting a coordinated pressure campaign. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. They were testing, probing, looking for weaknesses. But instead of finding weakness, they found resolve. And now they're scrambling to figure out what comes next. The coordination between these various Russian actions suggests central planning. This wasn't random. This was a strategy. But strategies only work when the enemy responds as expected. Ukraine didn't. Washington didn't. And now Moscow has to figure out their next move while their original plan lies in ruins. That's a dangerous position for any military power, and it's an especially dangerous position for one led by a man who cannot afford to show weakness. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a major offensive, using these provocations as cover for military preparations. Another is that Russia is attempting to create diplomatic leverage, escalating tensions to force negotiations on favorable terms. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to test whether tactical nuclear threats might cause Western hesitation. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't hesitate when authorization came. They didn't wait for further diplomatic consultations. They didn't pause to gauge Russian reaction. They struck hard, fast, precisely. And in doing so, they demonstrated that threats will not deter them. That escalation will be met with escalation. That every Russian provocation will have consequences. This is the message Moscow needed to hear. Because the only thing that deters a bully is strength. And tonight, Ukraine showed strength that even Moscow cannot ignore. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Western unity will crack under pressure. Ukraine wants to show that their determination remains unshakable. The Pentagon wants to prevent Russian victory without triggering direct confrontation. And European allies want to prevent the war from spilling beyond Ukraine's borders. All of these objectives are being tested simultaneously. Every decision matters. Every signal is analyzed. Every action has consequences. This is high-stakes geopolitics in real time. And tonight, the balance shifted. Maybe not permanently, maybe not irreversibly, but significantly. Because Russia learned something today that they didn't know yesterday. American commitment to Ukraine is not theoretical. It's not conditional. It's real. And it comes with weapons that can reach targets Moscow thought were untouchable. That changes the calculation. That changes everything. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements across multiple regions. They say Russian forces are repositioning air defense assets to protect installations that were previously considered low-priority targets. They say Russian command and control networks are showing signs of disruption consistent with the Ukrainian strikes we discussed earlier. And they say Russia's decision to escalate tensions is likely part of a broader strategy intended to create chaos before expected spring diplomatic initiatives. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that aggression will be answered, and it sent a message to Washington that their investment in Ukrainian defense is paying dividends. This is what successful deterrence looks like. Not threats, not rhetoric, action. And when action speaks, even the Kremlin listens. The coming days will be critical. Russian response to these strikes will tell us much about their remaining capabilities and their strategic thinking. But whatever comes next, today marked a turning point. A day when the balance of this conflict shifted, perhaps permanently, in Ukraine's favor. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with their recent provocations. But what we do know is that Washington's response was timely. It prevented Russia from believing that aggression would go unanswered. It provided Ukraine with the tools they need to take the fight to Russian forces, and it sent a message to allies and adversaries alike that American commitment remains strong. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase. If he backs down, Washington and Kiev have already shown they are ready to press their advantage. They have shown they are ready to act. They have shown they are ready to win. The initiative has shifted. The momentum has changed. And for the first time in months, Russia looks uncertain. That uncertainty is strategic gold, because uncertain enemies make mistakes. And mistakes in war have consequences. Tonight, the consequences are becoming clear. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times, but continues to forget. Ukraine will not surrender. The West will not abandon them. And every escalation will be answered with force. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Russia's gamble is failing. Ukraine's resolve is unbroken. And the weapons that will shape the next phase of this war are now in Ukrainian hands. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're covering every major development in this conflict as it happens. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening on the ground. And drop a comment below. What do you think Putin's next move will be? I read every comment, and I want to hear your analysis. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next one.